Hi, welcome to my talk, Find Me If You Can, How to Locate DLL's Unexported Functions. I'm Oryan. I really love Windows internals, reverse engineering, and generally learning new things. On my day-to-day job, I work as a low-level researcher and developer at Symantec. So usually I'm in charge on detecting malwares, but today I'm on the hacker side. And today, so are you. So let's say that we want to take over the world. And in order to do so, we want to run our own code on a remote process. So when we want to run our code on a remote process, we need to load our code into its memory. A legitimate process will usually use the WinAPI function, will ask the remote process to call to the WinAPI function a load library. A malicious process can do the same. But since this function is monitored by antiviruses and registered into internal structures of the operating systems, it can raise an alert. And we don't want this to happen. So that's not a really good option. Instead, we can write our own loader, which will be implemented pretty much like the original function, but we'll skip the parts that we want to skip. This technique is called reflective loader. And in order to implement it, we will need to use the internal functions that the original function uses. One of these functions is LDRP and LTLS data, and this would be our target function for today. And it's important to understand that we don't really have to understand what this function does at this moment. All we have to know is that we need this function, we need to use this function, so we have to look for it. And why is it so hard to find it anyway? So, while we can use exported functions, both statically importing its DLL and call it from our code, or dynamically using the WinAPI function getProcAddress, with unexported functions, we can't. So why is that? And actually, every module has a table that maps some of its function's name to their addresses in memory. And unexported functions are all the functions that don't appear in this table. So we have to find them ourselves. So today we're going to cover 3 different ways to locate our target functions. Then we will compare their stability on different OS versions. And finally, we'll choose our favorite way to use. Our first way to locate this function would be to find a unique byte sequence inside our target function. So this is part of the code of our target function. And this is the disassembled function taken from the compiled binary using the IDA disassembler. And it consists of 2 parts. There's the instruction of the code, and there's the actual byte representation in memory. Now let's take a look at these 2 lines of code and their byte sequence. This byte sequence is unique, and it appears only once in the entire module. So we can use it, we can search it for it in memory. And then, once we find it, all we have to do is decrease its offset to the start address of the function. So our formula would be the byte sequence address minus the offset. So let's say that the byte sequence address would be this address, and its offset would be 46 in hexa. So our target function would be in this address. Our second way to find this function would be to locate a direct function call using a unit byte sequence. So this is the function who calls our target function, and this is the actual call instruction to our function. And this call instruction also consists out of two different parts. There is the actual call opcode, which is represented by E8, and it's followed by the offset of the function that we're of the target function, which is relative to the end of this call instruction. Now let's take a look at these few lines of code, and these are the preparation for passing the parameters to the function. And generally speaking, it should be more stable to use their byte sequence instead of locating a random byte sequence, because this one depends on the function signature, and this one is less likely to be changed. So we can search for this byte sequence in memory. Of course, it also has to be unique. And then all we have to do is to add the offset that we found that follows it. So this time, our formula would be the byte sequence address plus the byte sequence length and the offset that we found. So let's say that this time our byte sequence address would be this address, and the byte sequence length would be 11 bytes. And then we have to add 4 more bytes because this is the offset length, and as we mentioned before, the offset is relative to the end of the call instruction. So our total length is 15. And then all that's have to do is to add the offset that we found, which is 47. So we'll find this address in memory, which is exactly the same address that we found before. So we have 2 different ways to locate the same address in memory, which is pretty cool. Our last way to locate this function in memory would be to locate an indirect function call. And what does it mean? So let's take a look again at the function that calls our target function. And if so far we focused on the byte representation, now let's focus on the actual instruction. So let's zoom out for a second, and we have this function, our target function, which we already mentioned that it's internal. And we have the function that calls it, right? So what if this function that calls it is also internal, and the function that calls it, and the function that calls it, and the function that calls it, and so on, until we get to our exported function. And of course, let's not forget that the function that calls our target function can also call other functions as well. So back to our code. And this time, I want us to focus on the fuller view of this function. And we can see here that it has 5 function calls inside. And our function is the second function that's being called. So if we'll step into the offset that we found in the second call in this function, we will get to our target function, right? But remember this picture? Well, we found a way to find our target function, but how can we find the function that calls it? And the function that calls her, and so on and so on. So the answer is exactly the same. Now let's take a look at the calls flow. And this is the functions, this is our exported function in our case, LDR load DLL. If we'll step into the second call out of the 8 calls in this function, we'll get to the function LDR pload DLL. Then, if we'll step to the third call, we'll get to this function. Then we'll step into the 5th call out of 21 function calls, which it tells us that this function is probably bigger. Then we'll step into the first call, then to the 6th call, and eventually, like we previously saw, the second call from there will give us our target function. Once we found the function address in either one of these ways, we can simply use it in our code by calling it from our code. And it's that simple. Now, okay. So now let's talk about the stability on different OS versions. And the first method that we saw was to search for a unique byte sequence inside our target function. And actually, this turned out to be the most stable way. We covered all Windows 10 versions through only 2 unique byte sequences, which is pretty cool. Then we have the direct function call, and this turned out to be the most unstable version way to find the function in this case. We had more than 4 or 5 different byte sequences, so it's less likely for us to use this method in this case. And the last option was to find the exported function and then step into the inner calls until we get to our target function. And actually, in this case, we saw some functions that might be too complex in this particular flow. But it still had 2 main options through all Windows 10 versions, and the functions were called relatively at the beginning of the functions, so we could rely on this. If the function had too much calls or the amount of calls would change too often between the Windows versions, then we couldn't rely on this method. But the most important part to say here is that it can change between different functions. So there isn't a right or wrong way. All of these 3 ways works, but you have to choose what's better fitted for your specific function that you're looking for. Now we have 3 different ways to find our function. We can successfully run our code on the remote process. And that's it. For any further question, you can find me on Twitter. This is my Twitter handle. And thank you for listening.